Yesterday I presented the European part of my research and only a little part of Ontological research, Buddhological more exactly. And I've stopped more exactly on the position that ontology of Buddhism is the ontology of substrateless process, and that in Buddhism, in its essence, there is no doctrine of reincarnation. According to Buddhism, just the energy which connects this existence with existence of his karmic successor, so to speak, is transferred. A similar transmission of energy occurs in essence also during every moment of the one life. Sensoric existence is a repeatability of situations and roles, painful monotony of cyclic reproducibility of the same contents. The mind, manas, learning on the previous experience, provides the memory and feeling of identity of the personality. The law of karma, the karma wheel in Buddhism, is also not a requital of punishment, like in the theistic schools, darshanas of Brahmanism and Hinduism, where karmic fruits are distributed by the Almighty Ishvara. The law of karma is quite objective and inevitable, like the laws of nature in their Western scientific understanding. It is possible to say that in their sensoric existence, the person, owing to his ignorance, non-vision, avidya, supposing that he is the subject, the personality, he has an immortal soul or atman, or that there is an objective world, so the person is alienated from his original being. The stream of psychophysical life of a person which has not been focused on the discharging nirvana is determined by two major factors: egocentric affects, clashes, and the activity that inevitably generate the consequences, changes of health, diseases, happiness, misfortune, youth, old age, and at last death. Thus, the empirical existence of a person appears as spontaneous, non-self-sufficient, unstable, imperfect, as a dissatisfaction and a source of anxiety. Victoria Lysenko writes, "It's the scandalous lameness of the human existence, depreciating all pleasures of life, has forced Buddha to refuse the safe life in the palace and career of the governor, and to go on searches of the immortal." The end of quotation. The soteriological ideal of Buddhism, respectively, is the destruction of the ignorance, avidya, and the termination of causal dependence and cyclic alternations, respectively. Here we can see some analogy with the concept of a step from the reign of necessity to the reign of freedom in the Western philosophy. As for the term duhkha, it is often translated both as suffering and undergoing. It is necessary to understand it as a basic dissatisfaction with any form of empirical sensoric existence as such. However, initially during the Vedic period, the word duhkha meant difficult, unpleasant, pain, suffering, burdens, etc., and united all adverse aspects of the human existence, from the purely physical and psychological sufferings to the deep dissatisfaction with being in this world. First, dukkha was opposed to sukha, pleasure, enjoyment, but later in Buddhism, sukha was not opposed anymore to dukkha, as it was in the majority of Western philosophical and ethical schools, and joined in the volume of the last concept, because in the empirical sensoric existence everything is suffering, it is undergoing. Sukha in this context represents no more than fixing on a concrete fact of psychic life of a human being, but this life itself lies within the limits of action of dukkha. The most consecutive and systematic doctrine of dukkha as samsara and karma synonym and antipode of discharging nirvana belongs to Buddhism. For the Buddhist, all existence is suffering. It is undergoing. Both pleasant and unpleasant sensations and events are all part of existence. It is necessary to understand dukkha as an ontological groundlessness of the person, inequality to himself, as basic dissatisfaction with any form of empirical, karmic, sensory existence. The truth about dukkha was stated for the first time by Buddha in his sermon Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. But before passing to the logical and discursive analysis of the concept of dukkha in the Buddhist philosophical text, we should note the basic incomparability of the Buddhist concept of dukkha with the concept of suffering as it is present in the Judeo-Christian religious tradition. The suffering in the Old Testament tradition was comprehended as a divine punishment for a sin, a sign of rejectedness by God. Sufferings of the man were connected with the intrigues of the evil embodied in the image of Satan. Therefore, suffering was also the fight of the good and the evil in the soul of a man. The New Testament tradition continued this paradigm, but thus still sees in suffering the pledge of rescue. In the Gospel of Matthew we read, "He that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved." The cult of suffering in Christianity is connected with one of the major dogmas, the atonement doctrine. With his sufferings and the cross death, Jesus atoned for human sins. And such theological interpretations could arise only within the theistic tradition of the Abrahamic religions and are characterized by the idea of a personal relationship of God and man. In the Buddhist tradition, essentially non-theistic, dukkha as a spiritual principle is developed only in the sphere of the empirical, sensoric existence, and in the Judeo-Christian tradition it has a transcendent nature. Besides, in the latter case, suffering has a beginning, the fall, and in Buddhism, suffering has no beginning. Philosophical interpretation of the concept of dukkha in Buddhism is deprived of any psychologism and estimation inherent in the Western Judeo-Christian religious consciousness. In the European tradition, dukkha there corresponds rather existential concept of anxiety, concern, Sorge, fear, horror, angst, than Christian understanding of suffering. The first noble truth of Buddha sounds, everything is dukkha. But dukkha in Buddhism is a present, but not a primordial state of affairs, as it is caused not by the intrigues of evil forces or weakness of human nature, but with certain objective factors. And in this investigation, I'll try to find some strategies in the ontology of Buddhism, primarily Madhyamaka Darshana and the existential philosophy of Heidegger and Sartre. The second noble truth of Buddha is about the reason of suffering, thirst, Trishna, a passionate inclination, aspiration to experience and to experience of the world's perception. It is aspiration to stay in the sensoric world. We can compare with Ecclesiastes. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear is full of hearing. The end of quotation. But it is a question not only of sensual experience. Much more important, according to Buddha, is a spiritual thirst connected with ignorance, avidya, which is more difficultly surmountable. It is, for example, an aspiration to continuation to exist as myself, an empirical ego, or the thirst for an eternal existence, belief in the eternal Atman or the immortal soul. Or on the contrary, the thirst of non-existence, from the belief in Atman's destruction after death of a body, as in the darshan of Charvaka-Lakayata, to the thirst of death in the form of a suicide or aspiration not to be what you are. The individual empirical activity directed at the achievements of happiness, duhkha, which explicates in the sphere of karmic cause and effect dependencies, is inseparable from the ordinary sensory consciousness. Such blind concerning the causes and effect activity turns sensory subject into a subject of undergoing. In the different Buddhist darshanas, different classification or varieties of dukkha are offered. Unfortunately, I have no opportunity to analyze and even to enumerate them here. In general, the Buddhist doctrine states that this sensory being is defined by the following characteristics. First, everything is changeable, anitya. Second, all is suffering, undergoing, dukkha. Third, all is essenceless or is deprived of selfness, atma. Owing to the compound, caused and not substantive character, all the alive and lifeless is changeable, subject to destruction, and is deprived of any invariable support in the form of soul or atman or a material substance, dravya. This conditionality, which is expressing independence of any situation of the human being from a set of causes, including the factors of karmic character, makes the human being incomplete, not self-sufficient, groundless, and generate in him the feeling of a deep ontological dissatisfaction. As dukkha extends only on empirical sensory being of a person, it is not immanent to being or a person as such. Leaving the empirical reality, desires, and false intellectual constructs, a person can cease suffering. The paradox of dukkha for the European consciousness is that dukkha, as well as samsara, has no beginning but has the end, nirvana. That it is in the power of a man to put an end to that which has no beginning. Probably, partly for this reason, in the West, since the middle of the 19th century, various neo-Buddhist currents became so popular. In a paradoxical way, they coincided with dreams about the super-person, in a broad sense of this term, an absolute power, a power of the person over the initialless, even if at the price of loss of personality, imposed very much to many of Western intellectuals. The third noble truth, nirodha satya, is the mood of the termination of suffering, the neutralization of action and cause and effect factors represents a radical transformation of the present empirical condition of consciousness. But such transformation is possible only in case if there are its preconditions in the individual empirical psychophysical structure. Otherwise, the termination of suffering would operate as an act of transcendent character that in the Judeo-Christian tradition is called the granted divine grace. Buddha taught his disciples, Bhikkhus, what I am going to teach now is the noble truth of the extinction of suffering, the real truth which noble ones should know. It is the complete fading away and cessation of that hunger, Trishna, that craving without remainder, its forsaking and giving up, relinquishing, letting go, release and abandoning of the same craving. The end of quotation, Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. It is the nirodha satya, the central concept of this doctrinal situation. The termination, nirodha, is related to the word nirvana, from Sanskrit nir, to die away. The termination of any sensual experience is the partial synonym of nirvana. It is such a condition in which the expansion of the causality conditioned mental activity ceases. Buddha learned that it is possible by means of a certain practice, the fourth noble truth about the way of the termination of dukkha, of eradicating the reason Trishna to destroy in the individual existence dukkha itself. Now we need to consider the doctrinal and ontological foundation of the Buddhist soteriological doctrine. Each philosophical school of India, whether be it Nastika or Astika, Darshanas, Buddhism or Brahmanism, was a peculiar project of transformation, deconstruction of the personality for achieving an absolute discharging from suffering and undergoing both in metaphysical and an existential sense. Freedom, absolute and transcendent, is also the supreme value of the Buddhist culture. In what way can this freedom be achieved? The answer is simple. It is self-knowledge. Just remind that it's knowledge about yourself, being, genuine knowledge was the goal of Heidegger's and Sartre's philosophizing. This self-knowledge, understanding Veda is exactly what the Buddhist school offered as a project of getting rid of dukkha. What was it necessary to understand, to learn about yourself, to be released and cease to suffer, to undergo, how to find the original in the Buddhist sense of, in this case, existence? If the main purpose of the Buddhist soteriological project is a transformation of consciousness, a change of its type, that could be described as the replacement of the distinguishing, we remember, tetic in terms of Sartre and Husserl, consciousness vijnana, which is based on a subject-object dichotomy, by the non-dual advaya, consciousness gnosis, jnana, perhaps non-tetic. So it is obvious that the problems of mind, mentality, consciousness and mechanism of its functioning were in the center of attention of the thinkers from the very beginning of the tradition of Buddhist philosophizing, which was always the pure phenomenology of consciousness. According to the majority of Buddhist schools, those properties and qualities which we attribute to the external world are actually the projections of our own consciousness. The world is not the world in which we live, but the world which we endure. The Buddhist philosophy, as it is paradoxical, belonged substantially to logic and appealed to thetic consciousness instead of the area of jnana gnosis and understanding wisdom, prajna paramita, as the latter consists in a direct intuitive grasping of reality, for example of shunyata, emptiness, or perhaps nothingness, in the doctrine of Madhyamaka Shunyavada. But this reality is inexpressible within the subject-object frame, non-semiotic, it cannot be described, it is not dual, and consequently non-verbalized in the language with its grammatical and conceptual forms, which are adapted only to the description of the illusory mental constructs and projections, vikalpa, kalpana. It is traditionally considered that within Buddhism there were four philosophical schools, Sarvastivada and Sautrantika within the Hinayana Buddhism, and Madhyamaka Shunyavada and Yogacara Vijnanavada within the Mahayana Buddhism. In the aspect of our research, we are interested with the school of Madhyamaka Shunyavada and its founder, Nagarjuna. The most probable period of his life, 2nd century AC. Though the darshana of Madhyamaka claimed that its position is the middle vision, contrary to eternalism and nihilism extremes, we will try to prove that its nihilism, probably in our Western understanding, was the essence of the doctrine of this darshana. The comparative purpose of our research demands that the development of a certain meta-position. We cannot look at Heidegger and Sartre on the one hand and the darshana of Shunyavada on the other, so to speak, from within. Therefore, the task will consist in comparing all strategies of philosophizing concerning similar concepts. The ontological basis of the category is Sorge of Heidegger, being for itself of Sartre, nothingness of both of them, and concepts of duhkha and shunyata in the darshana of Madhyamaka. So the doctrine of Shunyavada in the most general view says that everything, all dharmas, is empty and deprived of its own nature, svabhava. Here it is very important to say about the category of shunyata, emptiness or hollowness, in the Shunyavada school. This term is present in the Buddhist text in Tipitaka for the designation of absence of the substantive ego in the personality or in the phenomenon. And starting with Mula Madhyamaka Karika of Nagarjuna, Shunyata becomes a central category of the philosophy of the Buddhism of Mahayana. Nagarjuna said that if everything exists only insofar it is causally determined, it means that nothing, not any dharma, does possess itself being, svabhava, that there is no such essence which could be self-sufficient, would exist by itself owing to its own nature. Everything is shunyata. So in the world, there are neither things nor event. There is no world itself also. The legend says that somehow Nagarjuna visited the parental house that day when his mother died. He told that nothing occurred because, on truth, nothing can occur at all. The world is eventless. His brothers, wise men Brahmans, nevertheless could not accept such radicalism, and they pitied their heartless brother. Nagarjuna wrote, when no entities exist, there is no becoming or destruction. Without becoming and destruction, there are no entities, existent entities. The end of quotation, Mula Madhyamaka Karika. And all that is semiotic, signful, described and verbalized is only visibility and illusion, a fruit of the activity of distinguishing tetic, we remember thought vikalpa and its construct kalpana. Moreover, according to Nagarjuna, the causality itself, pratitya samutpada, a transcendent condition of the hollowness of all existence, is itself empty and does not exist. Emptiness is also empty. It is not a certain metaphysical principle allocated with its own nature. It is the deprivedness of a self-being, svabhava. On this basis, Evgeny Torchinov and many other modern Buddhologists refused to recognize Nagarjuna and the school of Shunyavada as radical nihilists, as what they did not consider themselves, but just called them the skeptics. We unfortunately cannot agree with this opinion. If, after all, to contrive and seize the so-called slippery eel, as the adepts of Shunyavada called themselves and their opponents also did, the radical nihilism in ontological strategies will be discovered, and we will try to justify it. We can say that Shunyata is the ontological nothingness. And one of the illustrations of Madhyamaka's nihilism may be, for example, the refutation of the Four Noble Truths of Buddha by Nagarjuna. He writes, there is no truth of suffering, duhkha, or the case of suffering, or the cessation of suffering. There is no truth of the noble path. The end of quotation, Madhyamaka Karika. Nagarjuna considered that any attempt to create a metaphysical system adequate to reality is doomed to fail. Thinking that we describe being, we describe only our ideas of being, created by our distinguishing thinking, vikalpa, which accepts first of all subject-object dichotomy as a condition of empirical knowledge. In the beginning we have labels on the reality, and then we begin to study them, taking them for the reality itself. Nagarjuna applies the peculiar negative dialectics, which has полторы странички, все. Полторы странички. Не успеем обсудить. Окей.
Минут на дискуссию.
Ну, во время брейка. negative dialectics which has received the name prasanga, negative reasoning. In Mula Madhyamaka Karika, he considers and rejects as irrelevant such categories as causality, movement, time, space, form, quantity, quality, distinction, etc. We have, of course, no opportunity to reproduce his, even a part of his argumentation. And the theory of two truths or two levels of knowledge follows from it. The first level corresponds to the daily practice and empirical reality, sanvriti satya. Concerning this reality, we can speak about the conditional existence of space, time, causality, movement, objects, unity, multiplicity, form, quantity, quality, etc. This level differs from the pure illusions, mirages, dreams, hallucinations, and empty concepts. For example, horns over hair, a heavenly flower, fur over turtle, the sun over fruitless woman, etc. But the empirical reality is so illusory concerning the level of the highest truth, Paramartha Satya. This level is inaccessible to a logical discourse, but is conceivable, as I said, with powers of yogic intuition, prajna parmita. The purpose of Nagarjuna and the Madhyamaka Shunyavada school as a whole consisted in the substantiation of relativity and elusiveness of everything existing and mental, in the removal of any binary oppositions and hierarchies. According to relativism of Madhyamaka, nirvana is nirvana only in its relationship to samsara, as well as samsara only in its relationship to nirvana. Even nirvana does not possess self-being, svabhava, therefore both nirvana and samsara are empty and essenceless. Their general thisness, tathata, the original nature is shunyata, the emptiness, nothingness, in our Western understanding. Nagarjuna says, there is not the slightest difference between cyclic existence and nirvana. There is no the slightest difference between nirvana and cyclic existence. The end of quotation, Madhyamaka Karika. If it is not nihilism, what can be called nihilistic then? The rhetoric question. We could also say that Nagarjuna eliminates Kant's antinomies of pure reason. He writes, for example, everything is real and not real, both real and not real, neither real nor not real. There is neither eternity nor non-eternity, neither self nor selflessness, neither suffering nor enjoying, neither purity nor non-purity. Wherefore incorrect are those used. The end of quotation, Madhyamaka Karika. Well, conclusion. In their aspiration to overcome any binary oppositions and hierarchies, the Madhyamakas perhaps may be compared with Western postmodernists. But there is a radical difference. The Buddhists had a soteriological purpose, aspiration to release by finding a certain true knowledge. Understanding of hollowness of reality and mentality was a way to discontinuation of dukkha undergoing and finding of nirvana, which, as we know, does not have, according to Madhyamaka, itself being. And the postmodernists do not set any purposes of transcendent character. Let us return to Sartre. His phenomenology, though depriving the ego as a mental construct of the opportunity to be the core of consciousness and recognizing the conventionality of all objects and images, does not draw from this further conclusions, which were drawn by the Buddhists of Madhyamaka and also by other Buddhist darshanas. But it is not necessary for Sartre. His philosophy does not set before itself the soteriological purpose, which could be depriving of consciousness of its intentionality. First of all, I wrote about it, of non-equality to itself on undergoing the excruciating perceptions, images, representations, aspirations, as in his novel Nausea. Despite radical phenomenalism, the patrimonial trauma of the Western philosophy, the matter and consciousness dualism, after all, is not completely removed. So, in the existential philosophy and in the Buddhism of Shunyavada, there is a certain deconstruction of the subject. Obviously, subject of Brahmanist darshanas, which are the Buddhists deconstructed, and the subject of the Western philosophy of the new time deconstructed by Heidegger and Sartre, have very little in common. However, in all three doctrines, Heidegger, Sartre, and the Buddhist darshana of Madhyamaka, with the distinction of their ontological foundations and value purposes, secularity of both Europeans and the sacral aspiration of Buddhists, we can see the general strategy of philosophizing. Understanding the human consciousness as unequal to itself, non-self-sufficient, groundless, and in this sense suffering, unhappy. We can also see the aspiration to finding by a person of a certain true knowledge of himself, and being. The idea of the annihilating function of consciousness was also common for them. Consciousness introduces nothingness, shunyata, ides genuine knowledge about nothingness, shunyata, into the world. And the person can gain this genuine knowledge for different purposes, of course, in the secular existential philosophy and Buddhist philosophy and religion. For Heidegger, nothingness is an initial abyss from which being is extended, as we remember. For Sartre, annihilation and ontization means an essence and meaning of being of the person, so the ontological status of a person is the presence of negativity. From my point of view, it also belongs to the Buddhist school of Madhyamaka. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for the excess of time. Thank you very much.